wiring choice that we had because it was simple and it was what we were used to and it was what was big right now. And we're like, well, let's just do that.
Yeah, one of the principles of slow productivity is work at a natural pace.
Yeah.
What is that for humans?
Well, there's two parts to it. So for humans is what we just talked about, variations in intensity. And it's not just on one time scale, but basically all time scales, right? So when I went back and looked at how humans work before, within a day, you're going to have some periods that are more intense than others. In a week, some days will be more intense than others. When you're looking at a season, some seasons might be more intense than others. The fall harvest is way more intense than the winter. Even at a bigger time scale, you might have busier periods and less busier periods. I'm writing a book for 2 years, and then for the next year, I'm going more fallow, right? So variations, that's much more natural. Then the other principle that came out of that, and this was just from directly studying the great traditional knowledge workers of time past, they take much more time. So we try to go too fast. And a lot of these thinkers who were very productive in the sense of they produced, new scientific work that changed the way we understood the universe, they worked very slowly. Like their notion of how long should I take on this project was way slower than what we do today. So we're always trying to charge ahead right away. What's the quickest way I could get this done? They took their time, right? They're happy to take their time. Even contemporary traditional knowledge workers do this. Lin-Manuel Miranda was one of the examples I gave. His first play before Hamilton, In the Heights, was a big hit, right? 8 Tonys. He spent 7 to 8 years working on that play. Not procrastinating. He didn't put it aside for 8 years. He just was working slowly on it for 8 years, kept coming back to it. They were doing readings with real actors. Then he would go away and do some other stuff and think about it and try to get something better. And then they'd come back and do another reading. It's just this like slow process. But that's like pretty typical with traditional knowledge workers. We think in the pseudo productivity culture, it's like not fast as possible. I want to do a play. I'm going to like go away for a weekend and grind this thing out. Like let's rock and roll. That's not the way people used to do things.
What are the industries or job types for whom this changing of the pace doesn't work quite so well? Because there may be people listening who say, well, that's all well and good if your goal is to create over the next however many years a really great play, but that's not the world that I live in. That's not the profession that I have access to.
Right. So the whole goal is then how do we take these principles that the great traditional knowledge workers excavate, and then how do we apply them to just normal knowledge jobs, right? So all the advice is for knowledge work jobs, right? Basically, if you work on a computer screen for a living, if you send a bunch of emails, you're probably a knowledge worker. All right, so what does it look like to start adapting these ideas to a regular job where you have bosses or this or that? Well, now it becomes a little bit more subtle, but you get the same effect. So now when a boss asks you, hey, can you put together this report? Instead of you saying, sure, I'll have it done, and then you plug in the most optimistic possible estimate. We do, like, you fall in love with the idea of getting it done that fast. You instead take that estimate and you double it. Like, yeah, you don't say 1 month, you say 2 months. So you're giving yourself more time to work on it. And then what about like the seasonality? Well, if you're an entrepreneur, you can just start actually wiring this into your actual work rhythms, right? Like I talk about an entrepreneur in the book. She takes 2 months off in the summer. She just works it out, like the way her contracts and the clients, and she's just not around in that summer. It's about 20% less revenue. She'll happily take that hit to be able to take 2 months off in the summer. So she's getting, variation. And then we talk about people who work in jobs where they can't do that. Now they start doing this subtly, right? Okay, so here's what I do. I don't really schedule meetings on Mondays. I don't tell people I'm doing this. Like when they say, hey, when are you available? I give them lots of times. They just don't happen to have any on Mondays. Now we have like a slower start. And I know in December, because we're going to lose the last week anyways for Christmas, I'm kind of careful. I don't tell anyone about this, but I'm pretty careful to have projects set up to finish before that and start after it, but nothing gets really due into it. And I am turning down that intensity dial for those 3 weeks. And it's not long enough for my boss to really notice. But for me, it's a big deal knowing that I can wind down that month I'm wound down versus another month, right? So people can start implementing these principles, but like more surreptitiously. So we see them really flashily done in these historical stories. But then when we jump to implement them in practice, it's like more subtle, but it's the same principles. You're taking longer. You have variations in intensity on different times. This starts to add up, starts to make a difference.
Yes. Your first insight around do fewer things, which is essentially impossible for people to do because you look at a calendar and there's room in it and you fill well, there's a gap. The gap should be filled, should be doing things. And I think a lot of people feel like do fewer things is accomplish fewer things.
Yeah.
That's the conflation.
Yeah. And they're wrong. Yeah. Because if I add 2 words, it becomes clear. Do fewer things at once, right? Because here's what I think is going on. And this is like the case I make in the book, is that when you agree to something, the big problem is when you agree to it, that is going to bring with it administrative overhead, right? So whether I'm ready to work on this thing or not, now the team needs to, hey, how's it going? There's emails I'm going to have to answer. There's meetings going onto the calendar, right? You're like, hey, we got to check in on this. How's this doing? I call it overhead tax. Everything you say yes to generates overhead tax. So the problem is when you say yes to a lot of things, you're not just trying to keep keeping my queue really full so I always have something to do. That's not just what's happening. You're generating a lot more overhead tax. So the more things you've said yes to, the more things are generating administrative overhead, which means the more meetings go onto your calendar and the more emails that are coming that you have to answer, right? So where do those meetings come from that are filling up your calendar? They're not just random, right? It's not just, hey, let's just, you guys want to do a meeting? No, it's related to things you've agreed to do. So the more things you've agreed to do, the more of your time gets devoted to the administrative overhead of the things you need to do, which means you have less time available to actually accomplish the things. And to make it worse, this administrative overhead does not coalesce into like one nice big batch. It jumps all over your
fractures your day into what's the quote from Deep Work? I must have shared it a million times.
Shatters
your day into fragments so small that you get nothing meaningful done.
Yeah. Shatters something like that. You're scheduled into fragments so small, like insufficient for concentration.
Yes.
So,
whatever.
Nothing gets done. Yeah.
Yes. So I think about that all the time.
Well, but think what happens now though. This is why I think people are so burnt out, because it really is deranging. Think about this. So you say yes to too many things. Now your schedule is like completely full, not doing the things, but jumping on calls and answering people's emails about the things, right? Now you don't have time to really get them done. So what happens? You fall behind. So new things come in. So now the things you have to do get longer and you fall even farther behind. And then eventually you get to a place where most of your time is now taken up just dealing with talking about work. Nothing gets done. You feel like you're making no progress. You have to start getting up at 4 or working in the evenings, and now you're completely frustrated because you said I'm on Zoom all day long and now I'm working instead of being at my kid's basketball game. Like, what was the point of the day? And this is what's making knowledge workers cry uncle. So when I say do fewer things at once, this is not at all about accomplishing fewer things, because if you can save most of your schedule from all this administrative overhead, what happens? You start just executing. So now the rate at which you're finishing things and finishing them at really high quality levels, that skyrockets, right? So doing fewer things at once will make you actually accomplish many more things. That's not the only reason to do it. The main reason to do it is because it's entirely deranging to have your whole schedule be taken up by administrative overhead. I mean, it just makes life bearable not to be overloaded. But you have this bonus. You're also going to start producing, right? So if you can just bootstrap, and I have a lot of ideas how to do this, but if you can just bootstrap into doing fewer things, get over that initial fear, you're going to pretty quickly earn your ability to keep doing fewer things because you're going to be out shipping everyone else in your organization.
Yeah, the Zoom apocalypse that everybody went through when the overhead of having meetings and this, I guess, pain from management of coordination, if you can't see what someone's doing when they're in the house because they're no longer in the office, oh God, I mean, that's anxiety inducing, isn't it? So why don't we start looking at Slack dashboards and activity time? And then, a response to this, the anti-productivity movement was that law, was it France that brought it in, where bosses can't message their workers after 5 p.m., I think?
They tried, yeah. I don't know if the law, I don't know if it went through or not.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but it was the
topic for the podcast.
Well, it is interesting. Well, in France, they have labor unions that represent knowledge workers in a way that we don't in the U.S. But the problem with that, and I wrote about this some at the time, is, again, it's like putting the little bit of a Band-Aid on the wound. We got to stop the things that are creating the big wounds. Like, in other words, this is the issue with almost any response that is just focusing on, let's just reduce the time you can work. Let's have a 4-day work week instead of a 5-day work week, et cetera. The problem with these ideas is if you don't also fix the overload problem, you're not getting to the core issue, right? The core issue is I have too many things on my